Canada, 2005. Part 1. The Road to Nowhere. The biting cold of the northern Canadian wilderness seeped into every corner of the van as it crawled through the snowstorm. It was the kind of cold that reached into your bones, the type of cold that made every breath sting and every exhale turn into a cloud of frost. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her gloved hands gripping the seatbelt tightly as she gazed out of the fogged-up window. The van's wipers struggled to clear the heavy snow from the windshield, the rhythmic screech of rubber against glass adding a steady, almost haunting soundtrack to the storm outside. The snowstorm had descended upon them with a vengeance, much earlier than anyone had anticipated. What was supposed to be a smooth trip to a small northern town for their missionary work had turned into a journey through a frozen nightmare. The once clear road had disappeared under an unrelenting blanket of white, leaving them isolated in a desolate landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Even the trees, which had lined the road earlier, seemed to have vanished, swallowed whole by the storm. Rachel glanced at Elijah, who was driving. His face was tense, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The snowstorm had reduced visibility to nearly zero, and his eyes darted nervously from side to side, searching for any sign of the road ahead. The headlights of the van, once bright, barely pierced the swirling snow. "Elijah," Rachel said softly, her voice almost lost in the roar of the storm outside. "Maybe we should stop. We can't see anything, and it's getting worse." Elijah didn't take his eyes off the road, but Rachel could see the strain on his face. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but they were lost. They had been driving for hours, hoping to find some sign of life, some marker to guide them. But there had been nothing, only snow and ice, the unyielding wilderness stretching out in all directions. "We'll be fine," Elijah muttered, though his tone was more for his own reassurance than for Rachel's. "We just need to keep moving. Stopping out here would be worse." Rachel wasn't so sure. Every instinct she had was telling her that they needed to find shelter, that they couldn't keep battling the storm like this. The van was sturdy, but it wasn't invincible, and neither were they. In the back, Samuel and Miriam huddled together, their faces pale and drawn from the cold. They had wrapped themselves in every blanket they had brought, but it wasn't enough. The heat in the van was fading as the engine strained under the freezing temperatures. Miriam's lips were trembling, and Samuel's usually calm demeanor had given way to a nervous fidgeting, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting something, anything, to appear through the storm. "Elijah," Samuel finally spoke, his voice tight with concern. "Maybe Rachel's right. We don't know where we are. This storm, it's not normal." Rachel turned to look at him, and in the dim light, she could see the worry etched deep into his face. Samuel wasn't one to panic, but the situation was dire. The storm outside had become a living entity, battering the van with snow and wind so fierce that it felt as though they were driving into the very heart of a blizzard sent from another world. Elijah's jaw clenched. He knew they were on the edge of something dangerous, but he was determined to press on. The nearest town wasn't far. At least, it hadn't been the last time they'd checked the map. But that had been hours ago, before the storm had swallowed the road. And now, even the GPS had given up, the screen flashing error messages as the signal disappeared into the storm's fury. "We'll keep going for a bit longer," Elijah said, his voice resolute, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. "We can't be too far from the town." Rachel didn't argue, but she turned her gaze back to the window, her heart heavy with dread. She had always believed in the power of faith, in trusting God's plan even when the path was unclear. But right now, sitting in the middle of this blinding storm, faith felt like the only thing keeping her from falling into the abyss of fear. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the van's tires began to slip on the icy road, the engine groaning with the effort of pushing through the snow. And then it happened. A sudden, violent jolt. The van skidded to the side, the wheels losing traction entirely as the vehicle spun in a sickening circle. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the world outside became a blur of white, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She grabbed the dashboard for support, her knuckles turning white as the van careened toward the edge of the road. "Elijah!" she screamed, but it was too late. The van slammed into a snowbank with a deafening crunch, the impact throwing them all forward. For a few terrifying moments, it felt as though the van might tip over, but it finally came to rest, half buried in the thick snow. There was a long, eerie silence in the aftermath of the crash. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside the van, time seemed to have frozen. Rachel's ears rang from the impact, and her head swam with dizziness. Slowly, she lifted her hand to her forehead, wincing as her fingers brushed against a tender spot. Blood. She was bleeding, but it didn't seem serious. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice shaky. Elijah groaned from the driver's seat, his head resting on the steering wheel. He stirred slowly, blinking as if trying to clear his vision. I'm okay," he said, though his voice was weak. "Is everyone else?" In the back, Samuel and Miriam were dazed but conscious. Samuel had a gash on his arm from where he'd been thrown against the side of the van, but Miriam was unscathed, aside from the shock. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But relief was short-lived. They were stuck. The van was buried in snow, its wheels half sunken in the bank. The engine had died, and with it, the last vestiges of heat that had kept them from freezing. Already, the temperature inside the van was plummeting, and the frost on the windows was growing thicker by the minute. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the reality of their situation set in. They were stranded miles from civilization, in the middle of a deadly storm. No one knew where they were. No one was coming to help. She closed her eyes, fighting the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had always believed in the power of prayer, but now, in this moment, she needed that belief more than ever. She clasped her hands together tightly, her breath coming in shaky bursts as she whispered the words that had always brought her comfort. "Lord, we need you now more than ever," she prayed softly, her voice trembling. "Please guide us. Please show us the way." As she finished the prayer, a strange sense of calm washed over her, as though an unseen hand had reached out to steady her heart. She opened her eyes, her gaze moving to the others. Despite the fear, despite the cold, she knew they weren't alone. Somehow, deep down, she believed help would come, but it was hard to hold on to that hope in the face of the storm raging outside. And with every passing minute, the cold crept closer, threatening to steal away the last flickers of warmth from their bodies and their souls. Part 2. A flicker of hope. The cold inside the van was unbearable. It clung to their skin like a second layer, seeping into every bone and joint, leaving them shivering uncontrollably. Rachel could barely feel her fingers, even through the thick gloves she wore. Her breath came out in frosty puffs, adding to the already ice-covered windows. The van had become a frozen tomb, and the reality of their situation was sinking in fast. The storm outside raged on, the relentless wind howling like an animal, shaking the van with every gust. Snow piled higher against the doors, further trapping them in their icy prison. Elijah, still seated in the driver's seat, tried the ignition once again, but the engine only gave a sad, sputtering groan before falling silent. His face, usually calm and confident, now showed the cracks of doubt and fear. "It's dead," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration and exhaustion. "Batteries probably frozen." Samuel, sitting in the back, looked worse for wear. His face was pale, and his breathing shallow. The cut on his arm had stopped bleeding, but he was clearly feeling the effects of the cold. Miriam, beside him, clutched his hand, her own face drawn with worry. They had been driving together for years, doing mission work in the most remote places, but nothing had prepared them for this. The isolation, the merciless cold, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. It all weighed on them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Rachel glanced at Samuel and Miriam, her heart tightening in her chest. They were the strongest people she knew, but even they looked close to breaking. And then there was the cold. It was no longer just uncomfortable. It was becoming dangerous. Her eyes moved back to Elijah, who sat silently in the front seat, staring out at the storm. His face was tight with concentration, but Rachel could see the fear that gnawed at him beneath the surface. He was always the one to take control, the one to find a solution, but now there was nothing he could do but wait. And waiting in this kind of cold was a death sentence. "We can't stay here," Elijah finally said, breaking the silence, his voice gruff. He didn't turn to face them, but kept his eyes fixed on the windshield, as if hoping some miracle would appear through the blizzard. Rachel's heart sank further. She had known this was coming. The van was no longer a safe haven. It was slowly becoming a death trap. The longer they stayed, the more they would succumb to the cold. She could feel it in her own body. Her limbs were growing sluggish, her mind fuzzy. Even praying had become a battle against the numbing frost that gripped her soul. "What do we do, Elijah?" Miriam asked, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. Her hands trembled as she clung to Samuel, trying to share what little warmth they had left between them. Elijah exhaled deeply, his breath fogging up the inside of the van even more. He finally turned to face them, his expression grim. "We need to find shelter, something more than this van. If we stay here, we'll freeze before anyone can find us." "But where?" Rachel asked, her voice cracking with desperation. "We don't know where we are. We could be miles from the nearest house, and we can't see anything in this storm." Elijah ran a hand through his frost-dusted hair, frustration etched in every line of his face. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But we can't just sit here and wait for death. We have to try. Maybe there's something close. A cabin, a barn, anything." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Rachel wanted to believe him, but the storm outside seemed endless, and with each passing minute, their chances of survival were shrinking. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands together in prayer once more, though it was hard to focus with the fear gnawing at her insides. "Lord, please guide us. We need your help. We can't do this on our own," she whispered, her lips barely moving. The cold made it difficult to even form the words, but she forced them out, clinging to the belief that God was listening, that somehow he would show them the way. Suddenly a sound, faint at first, almost drowned out by the howling wind, but unmistakable. Rachel's eyes snapped open, and she strained to hear it again, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. There it was again, footsteps crunching in the snow. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was impossible. No one could be out there in this storm, not in this desolate wilderness. She looked at Elijah, who had also heard the sound, his eyes wide with disbelief. Before anyone could speak, a sharp knock echoed through the van, loud and clear. They all froze, staring at the door in shock. Rachel's mind raced. How could there be someone out here? And yet, there was no denying the sound. The knock was real. Whoever or whatever was outside wanted their attention. "Elijah," Samuel said, his voice trembling with both hope and fear. "What do we do?" Elijah's hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, uncertainty flashing across his face. For a brief second, Rachel thought he might refuse to open it, might leave whoever was out there to the mercy of the storm. But then, with a determined nod, he pulled the door open. The wind slammed into the van, filling the small space with a blast of icy air. But it wasn't the cold that took Rachel's breath away. Standing there, silhouetted against the blinding snow, was a figure, a man, tall and broad, his face hidden beneath a heavy hood and scarf. He was dressed for the cold, wrapped in layers of thick, dark clothing, and his presence seemed to fill the van with a strange, quiet energy. The man didn't speak right away. He just stood there for a moment, as if assessing the situation, before finally stepping forward into the van, bringing with him a rush of cold air. He moved with purpose, his steps deliberate, but there was something almost ethereal about him, like he didn't quite belong in the world of the storm or the van. Rachel's breath hitched as she met his eyes, dark and piercing, but somehow kind. "You're in trouble," the man said simply, his voice calm and deep, cutting through the roar of the storm outside. "This van won't save you. The storm's only going to get worse." Elijah nodded, too stunned to speak. It was as if this stranger had stepped out of nowhere, just when they needed him most. His words were both a warning and a promise. "There's a cabin nearby," the man continued, his eyes scanning the group. "It's not far. I can take you there. You'll be safe until the storm passes." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The stranger's offer sounded like a lifeline, but there was a part of her that couldn't help but wonder who this man was, how he had found them in the middle of this desolate place. And yet, she couldn't deny the sense of calm that had settled over her the moment he had appeared. Elijah glanced at Rachel, then back at the man. "We don't have any other choice," he muttered, mostly to himself. He turned to the rest of them. "We have to trust him. It's our only shot." Rachel nodded slowly. Trusting a stranger in the middle of a snowstorm wasn't something she would have considered under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. And something deep inside her, the same voice that had guided her prayers, told her this man had been sent to them for a reason. "Let's go," Elijah said, his voice firm. But beneath it, Rachel could hear the underlying fear. Without another word, they gathered what little they could carry, blankets, gloves, anything that would help keep them warm. The man waited patiently by the door, watching them with quiet intensity. There was something almost otherworldly about him, something that made Rachel feel both comforted and unnerved. But the urgency of their situation left no room for hesitation. One by one, they stepped out of the van and into the storm, following the stranger into the blizzard. Part 3. The Cabin in the Storm. The journey through the storm felt like an eternity. The wind howled violently, cutting through their clothing despite the layers they wore, and the snow was knee-deep, forcing every step to be an exhausting effort. Rachel clung to the small bundle of blankets in her arms, her head bowed against the onslaught of ice and snow, each gust slamming into her like a wave. She followed the stranger, his dark figure looming ahead of them, moving with a confidence that seemed almost impossible in these conditions. The storm was relentless, a living thing that clawed at them with frozen talons. The night had grown darker, and the swirling snow made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. If not for the man leading them, Rachel was certain they would have been lost in the storm. It was as if he knew every step of the way, navigating through the blizzard as though it was a well-trodden path, while the rest of them struggled to keep up. Elijah, walking beside her, stumbled more than once, his strength clearly waning. Rachel reached out to steady him, her hands numb, barely able to grasp his arm. She could feel the exhaustion weighing on all of them, the cold seeping into their bones, draining their energy with each passing minute. Miriam, who had been walking behind them, was gasping for breath, her face pale and drawn, her movements sluggish. Samuel, though equally exhausted, kept his arm around her, helping her push through the snow. Rachel's own legs burned with the effort of walking, her muscles aching from the constant battle against the wind and snow. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, each inhale like needles in her throat. The storm felt endless, and with every step, she wondered if the cabin truly existed, or if it was just a desperate hope they were clinging to. But the stranger never faltered. He moved with a purpose, his dark coat whipping in the wind, his tall frame cutting through the snow as if it were nothing. There was something almost unnatural about his movements, graceful despite the brutal conditions. His head remained low, and his face was still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. But even in the worst of the storm, he never hesitated. Rachel couldn't help but feel an eerie calm in his presence, despite the danger they were in. The storm raged around them, but with the stranger leading the way, it was as if they were insulated from the full force of nature's fury. She didn't know how to explain it, but somehow she felt safe. As they continued their treacherous march, Rachel found herself praying silently, over and over, words of gratitude and pleas for strength. "Thank you, God, for sending him," she whispered in her heart. "Thank you for this chance. Please help us make it through." After what felt like hours, just when Rachel's legs were about to give out, the stranger finally stopped. She almost ran into him, too exhausted to react quickly enough. He turned to them, his voice calm and firm despite the storm. "It's just ahead," he said, pointing into the darkness where the swirling snow seemed to relent just enough to reveal a faint outline. A small structure, barely visible through the storm. Rachel squinted, her heart lifting in her chest as the outline of a cabin began to take shape. It was small and unassuming, but to her, it was a beacon of hope, a promise of warmth and safety. Elijah let out a breath of relief beside her. "Thank God," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. The man moved forward again, leading them toward the cabin. As they drew closer, the details of the structure became clearer. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and worn by years of harsh winters. Snow had piled high around its foundation, and its roof sagged under the weight of the storm. It looked abandoned, the kind of place long forgotten by time. But in that moment, it was the most welcoming sight Rachel had ever seen. The stranger pushed open the door with a firm hand, and it creaked loudly on its rusty hinges. Inside, the darkness was absolute, but there was an immediate sense of warmth that made Rachel's breath catch. She had expected the interior to be as cold as the storm outside, but as they stepped in, the air felt different, warmer, almost as if a fire had been lit, though there was no hearth in sight. "Get inside," the man urged, holding the door open for them as they all hurried in, their limbs stiff from the cold. Once they were inside, he closed the door firmly behind them, shutting out the howling wind and snow. The relief was instantaneous. The storm's fury was muted, reduced to a distant roar, and the stillness inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Rachel felt the warmth envelop her, thawing the frost that had settled into her bones. She didn't understand how the cabin could be so warm, but right now, she didn't care. She collapsed onto one of the old wooden benches lining the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. Miriam and Samuel huddled together, their faces pale, but filled with gratitude as they wrapped themselves in blankets. Elijah, too, sank down against the wall, his face still lined with the strain of their journey, but his eyes closed in relief. Rachel looked around, taking in their surroundings. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, with rough wooden walls and a single table in the center. There were no signs of life, no fire, no food, nothing that indicated anyone had been here recently. And yet, the warmth was undeniable, as if the cabin itself was sheltering them, holding off the cold and danger outside. The stranger stood by the door, watching them in silence. Rachel felt a strange sense of peace in his presence. There was something about him, something otherworldly, as though he existed just beyond the reach of reality. She wanted to thank him, to ask him who he was, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, it was Elijah who spoke, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Thank you," he said, looking up at the man. "I don't know how we would have made it without you." The stranger gave a small nod, his face still obscured by the shadows of his hood. "You'll be safe here," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that soothed Rachel's frayed nerves. "The storm will pass soon." Rachel's heart swelled with gratitude, and she finally found her voice. "Who are you?" she asked, her words filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "How did you find us?" The man was silent for a moment, his dark eyes gazing at her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight into her soul. Finally, he gave a faint smile, a smile filled with mystery and kindness. "I'm just someone who helps when it's needed," he said, his tone gentle but firm, as if that was all the explanation she would get. Rachel wanted to press further, but before she could say another word, the man turned toward the door. "Rest now," he said quietly, his hand on the door handle. "Help will come soon." And with that, he opened the door and stepped out into the storm, disappearing into the blinding snow as if he had never been there at all. Rachel stared at the door, her mind racing. There was something about this man, something that defied explanation. She knew, deep down, that he wasn't just an ordinary traveler. He had appeared when they needed him most, guided them to safety, and now, he was gone without a trace. She exchanged a look with Elijah, who seemed just as bewildered. "Who do you think he was?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Elijah shook his head slowly, still staring at the closed door. "I don't know," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "But I think we were meant to meet him." Rachel nodded, her heart swelling with the same sense of awe. The warmth of the cabin, the peace that filled the air, it all felt like a gift, something beyond the natural world. She couldn't explain it, but in her heart, she knew they had been saved by something or someone divine. Part 4. The Rescue. Rachel awoke to an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the howling storm from the night before. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, her body aching from exhaustion and the cold. The warmth inside the cabin had allowed her to sleep more deeply than she thought possible. But now, the quiet felt almost unnatural. Slowly, she opened her eyes, blinking against the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The storm had passed. The only sound was the soft creaking of the cabin as it settled, and the occasional distant groan of snow sliding off the roof. Rachel sat up, her muscles protesting with every movement, but she ignored the discomfort, her mind racing back to the events of the previous night. The man. She glanced toward the door, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for them. But the cabin was empty, save for her and the others, still huddled together, wrapped in blankets, their faces peaceful in sleep. The stranger had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived, leaving them with nothing but questions. "Elijah," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking the stillness. Elijah stirred, his eyelids fluttering open as he groaned and shifted in his makeshift bed against the cabin wall. Slowly, he sat up, rubbing his eyes as the memory of the previous night settled over him. His gaze met Rachel's, and she saw the same confusion and wonder in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "He's gone," Elijah murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Rachel nodded, her mind still grappling with the surreal nature of what had happened. The storm, the man, the cabin, it all felt like a dream. But the warmth of the cabin, the safety they had found, was real. And so was the stranger who had led them here. Before she could respond, the door to the cabin creaked open, and a blast of cold air swept inside, though it lacked the vicious bite of the night before. Samuel stood in the doorway, bundled in his coat, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. His face was pale, but his eyes were bright with the promise of survival. "Rachel, Elijah," he called softly, his voice tinged with urgency. "You need to see this." Rachel exchanged a look with Elijah, who immediately rose to his feet, his expression shifting to one of concern. Together, they stepped outside, bracing themselves against the chill as they followed Samuel into the snow-covered landscape. The world outside the cabin was transformed. The storm had left behind a pristine layer of snow, glittering under the soft light of the early morning sun. The sky, once obscured by dark clouds, was now a clear, endless blue, stretching out in all directions like a promise of hope. It was as if the storm had never existed, the violence of the previous night erased by the peaceful calm of dawn. But what truly caught Rachel's attention was not the beauty of the morning. It was the group of figures approaching them through the snow. In the distance, a team of rescuers was making their way toward the cabin, their brightly colored coats standing out starkly against the white landscape. Rachel's heart leaped in her chest, a rush of relief flooding through her veins. They were saved. Help had come. "They're here," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay." Rachel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she watched the rescuers draw closer, their faces filled with concern and determination. It was over. The fear, the cold, the uncertainty, it was finally over. She had prayed for a miracle, and it had come in ways she could never have imagined. Elijah placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, squeezing gently as they stood side by side, watching the rescuers approach. "We made it," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. Rachel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. But even as the relief washed over her, her thoughts drifted back to the man who had led them here. The one who had appeared in the midst of the storm and disappeared just as quickly. Who was he? And how had he known to find them? As the rescuers reached them, One of the men stepped forward, his face lined with concern. "Are you all okay?" he asked, his voice urgent as he surveyed the group. "We've been searching for you for hours. We didn't think anyone could survive that storm." "We're okay," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "Thanks to someone." The rescuer frowned, glancing between them. "Someone?" "Oh." Rachel took a deep breath, her mind racing to find the words to explain what had happened. But how could she? How could she describe the man who had saved them, the warmth of the cabin, the feeling of peace that had settled over them, despite the chaos outside? "There was a man," she began, her voice soft but firm. "He found us in the storm. He led us here to this cabin." The rescuer's brow furrowed in confusion. "A man? Out here?" He shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. No one lives in this area. It's been abandoned for years." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Abandoned? She glanced back at the cabin, its weathered walls standing against the backdrop of the snow-covered trees. It certainly looked abandoned, but the warmth inside, the safety they had found, it felt anything but. "He was real," Rachel insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "He saved us. Without him, we wouldn't have made it." The rescuer exchanged a look with his colleagues, his expression unreadable. "We'll talk more once we get you all checked out," he said finally, his tone cautious but kind. "Let's get you back to town." Rachel nodded, her mind swirling with questions, but she knew there would be no answers here. Not yet. She followed the others as they were led to the rescue vehicles, her steps heavy with both relief and uncertainty. The journey back to town was quiet, the weight of what had happened settling over them like a heavy blanket. As they drove through the snow-covered landscape, Rachel couldn't help but glance out the window, her eyes searching for any sign of the man who had saved them. But the forest remained still, the snow undisturbed, as if their nightmarish ordeal had been wiped clean by the morning light. She leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes as the warmth of the rescue vehicle enveloped her. The questions would have to wait. For now, she was simply grateful to be alive. Part 5. The Mystery of the Invisible Guardian. The small town, nestled in the valleys of northern Canada, was a picture of serenity as the rescue vehicle pulled into the snow-dusted streets. The storm had left its mark on the landscape, with snow piled high along the roadsides and the rooftops of the quaint homes covered in thick white layers. But the sun now shone brightly, reflecting off the snow like 1,000 diamonds, creating a sense of calm and renewal that contrasted sharply with the turmoil Rachel and the others had just experienced. As the van came to a stop in front of the town's only clinic, Rachel felt a strange mix of relief and unease. They were safe, back among civilization, yet the mystery of their survival, of the man who had guided them through the storm, still weighed heavily on her mind. She had hoped that arriving in town would bring answers, but instead, it seemed to raise more questions. The clinic was small, but warm and welcoming. The doctor, an older man with kind eyes and a soft voice, ushered them inside quickly, immediately tending to their frostbitten fingers and windburned faces. The warmth of the building was soothing, and as Rachel sat on one of the examination tables, sipping a cup of hot tea, the events of the last 24 hours began to settle in. She looked around the room. Elijah was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, staring out of the window with a distant look in his eyes. Samuel and Miriam sat beside each other, wrapped in thick blankets, their hands still clasped together. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. But the question that lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, was how. After the doctor had checked their vitals and declared them all to be miraculously in good health, he left them to rest in the waiting room. The quiet in the room was heavy, as if none of them knew quite how to process what had happened. Rachel felt a knot tighten in her stomach, and after a long pause, she spoke. "I keep thinking about him," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "The man who saved us. It doesn't make sense. Who was he? And how did he know where to find us?" Elijah, who had been silent for most of the morning, finally turned to face her. His expression was one of deep contemplation, the same questions clearly running through his mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't an accident, that he was there for a reason." Miriam nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and confusion. It's like it felt like he was sent to us. Out of nowhere, in the middle of that storm. No one else would have been able to find us, but he did. And the cabin, it was warm, even though it was abandoned. Rachel shivered, not from the cold, but from the memory of the man's presence. There had been something otherworldly about him, something she couldn't quite put into words. He didn't even tell us his name, she murmured, her thoughts drifting back to his calm, steady voice. And when we asked, he just left. Elijah crossed the room, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor as he approached the window. He looked out over the snow-covered town, the weight of the mystery heavy on his shoulders. "Do you think?" He paused, his voice trailing off as if he were hesitant to say the words aloud. But Rachel knew what he was asking. She had thought it too, though it seemed impossible. "Do you think he was an angel?" Samuel finished for him, his voice quiet but sure. The room fell silent again as the question hung in the air. It seemed too fantastical to believe, yet it was the only explanation that made sense. How else could they explain what had happened? The man had appeared when all hope was lost, guided them to safety, and then vanished without a trace. Rachel's mind raced back to her prayers, whispered in the dark, cold van. She had prayed for help, for guidance, and then the man had come. Her heart swelled with emotion as the realization hit her. It hadn't been a coincidence. It hadn't been chance. It had been divine intervention. "I think," Rachel began, her voice thick with emotion, "that God heard our prayers, and he sent someone to save us." The others nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling over them like a warm blanket. It was the only explanation that felt right. They had been lost in the storm, on the verge of death, and then this stranger had appeared, calm, unflinching, and filled with a presence that had brought them peace even in the midst of chaos. As they sat there, reflecting on the miracle they had experienced, the door to the clinic opened, and an older man stepped inside. He wore a heavy coat, his graying beard covered in frost, and his eyes gleamed with curiosity as he looked at the group huddled together. "Are you the ones who were rescued from the storm last night?" he asked, his voice deep and weathered from years spent in the harsh northern wilderness. Elijah stepped forward. "Yes, that's us. We were caught in the blizzard, and a man," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "A man led us to an old cabin. He saved our lives." The older man furrowed his brow, confusion flashing across his face. "An old cabin?" he repeated, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Where exactly was this cabin?" Rachel quickly described the location as best as she could, detailing the surrounding forest and the distance from where their van had been stranded. The man listened intently, nodding along, but his expression remained puzzled. "There hasn't been a livable cabin in those woods for decades," he said slowly. "Most of the old structures out there fell apart years ago. And as for someone living in that area," he shook his head, "no one's lived in those parts for a long, long time." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "But we were there. It was warm. It kept us safe through the night." The older man tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "It sounds like you've experienced something beyond the ordinary. Many folks around here talk about the guardian of the woods, an old legend. Some say it's a spirit, others say it's an angel. I've never seen him myself, but there have been stories. People in danger, lost in the wilderness, being guided to safety by a mysterious figure who vanishes as quickly as he appears." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at the others, seeing the same stunned expression mirrored in their faces. "Do you think that's who saved us?" she asked quietly. "The guardian?" The man shrugged, but there was a knowing gleam in his eyes. "I don't know, but it sounds like you had a brush with something, or someone, who watches over these lands." A silence fell over the room, but it was a silence filled with awe and reverence. Rachel felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the explanation, she knew in her heart that they had been saved by something greater than themselves. Whether it was an angel, a guardian spirit, or some other divine force, they had been guided through the storm and brought safely to the other side. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Rachel paused for a moment at the door, her hand resting on the frame as she looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, the sky was clear, and the world felt new. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp, cold air, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured. Her words carried on the wind, though she wasn't sure to whom they were directed. Maybe to the man who had led them, maybe to the guardian of the woods, or maybe to God himself. But it didn't matter. The feeling of being protected, of being watched over, was enough. With one last glance at the snow-covered woods, Rachel stepped outside, joining her friends as they began the journey back home, forever changed by the invisible guardian who had saved their lives. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.